Good afternoon, evening, morning, dead of night. I don't know where you are. Thanks for joining us. It is time for Meet Your Makers with Phil. Today, we have a very special moment. This is a very special episode because it is our first repeat guest, the wonderful, the astute, the cordial, the very, very wonderful Eddy Webb. Eddy, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back. I didn't realize that was your first repeat guest.
Repeat guest. Which I think is perfectly appropriate. And so today's episode, if in case people didn't know this, in case people have been living, hiding, stooping under rocks and other such paraphernalia, anything that'll keep you hidden away from obvious news. You've got a new game coming out, yes?
Just give me a second. I'm trying to now imagine a news bunker, and actually, that sounds kind of great in 2024. Like a fallout shelter, but it just blocks Twitter and newspapers from hitting you. And
isn't that the dream? Isn't that
right?
Yes. A nuclear shelter, but it's for social media and news in general, and you just sit there bobbing your head, playing games and rolling dice. That's.
Okay, you stick your head out. It's like get the weather report and then dick back in.
It's a bit cold. Anyway, +4 modifier. And oh, man, now I'm sad. I want that to be real.
I know. Now I want there to be a news bunker.
I need that in my life. Why can't we have that?
If you do have a news bunker, first of all, congratulations.
Yes.
And second of all, yes, we are now doing a crowdfunding campaign for Curious Cats of Mao, which is not exactly Monarchies of Mao Second Edition.
Not exact. Okay, well let's start from that then. Let's start from the beginning when it comes to the Curious Cats of Mao. When it came to the original Monarchies of Mao sort of thing, that was its own system, essentially. It was similar. How would you compare the original Pugmire versus Monarchies of Mao in terms of what they represented, what they were like?
They were fairly similar, right? The core rules were pretty close to identical. There were a few tweaks and modifications, but you could fit them more or less on a postcard, right? It wasn't a ton of difference. The core rules,
right?
So a lot of it was basically along the lines like, here's new, powers for your characters. Here's a whole bunch of new spells, a whole bunch of new things. My grand initial idea was I wanted to have 3 interconnected core games, drawing from inspirations like Chronicles of Darkness and whatnot, where it's like you have you pick any of these as a gateway to get in, and then if you like the other games, you could play them and they're cross compatible. But a couple things I realized after we did that. The first was that they were a little too close together. There is actually a sweet spot, as much as people talk about how they get frustrated. It's like, why are these things not more compatible? In truth, I don't think people really want something that's super, super close and super on top of each other. They want things that are like 80% compatible, and they could do the other 20% by squinting real hard. And so it was a little too close. And so I think, at least the second point, was that a lot of people believed it to be or treated it like it was a supplement to Pugmire. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but from just purchasing numbers, it seemed that what people were doing is they would buy Pugmire and be happy with that, or buy other books around that. But people who bought Monarchies of Mao usually also bought Pugmire.
Right.
And of course, finally, it just didn't sell as well as Pugmire, right? Like, say what you like or what you want about it is, I don't think it's because people don't want games with cats, because clearly there's a huge market of
that. I refuse to believe that has any.
Right.
Come on now. Come on.
Right. I think what probably happens, people said, well, I like this idea, but I already have most of this stuff already, so I don't need to buy another book. So when it came time to do a new edition, and as a real quick to wrap up the point. So Squeaks into Deep was originally going to be a full rule book as well, but we saw those numbers, we decided to go ahead and convert that into a supplement. And so that kind of became a test ground for what we could do with Curious Cats. The idea of, okay, if we make this into a supplement, what does that look like? How does that work? When we already made this decision, we also realized, working on both Pirates of Pugmire and Squeaks in the Deep, that trying to make a supplement that works for both source books was a lot rougher, because like for all the stuff it says, these stuff's largely the same material. We had to design as if you had only one of them. So it's on page 84 of this, or page 96 of Monarchies of Mao, or, reference this thing or that thing. Oh, by the way, this one little thing is in Mao, but it's not in Pugmire, so we have to duplicate it here on the off chance that you only have Pugmire. It just became a huge hassle. So that was not something that was the initial reason behind it, but once we started doing it, it's like, this is going to help with that. Supplements can be very clear now. We have one core rule book, which is Realms of Pugmire. Everything builds off of that.
Right. Now, when it comes to, is this meant to encourage more of a crossover feel then, in that sense, like having parties with a little bit of both in them, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I still very much feel like the game is going to constantly reference the big three, dogs, cats, and rodents. And again, some of this is drawing a bit on my World Darkness-ish experience, where it's like, yes, all of the other games are cross-compatible, but in World Darkness stuff, you tend to talk about vampires, werewolves, and mages. You talk about the original trinity. And then, you might also have rules for hunters and changelings and whatnot, but those are more optional. But if you're going to do a crossover book, you've got to talk about those three in some form or fashion.
Yeah.
And so I feel like Realms of Pugmire is kind of in the same boat. It's like, if we do source material, we're probably going to talk at least a little bit about all three. So even if it's a dog focused one, we're going to mention cats and rodents a little bit, and so on and so forth. But then as you get further out from those three, it gets a little dicier, right? So like the game is now more explicitly a dog-centered game. Pugmire is really about dogs, so dogs are always talked about. Cats and rodents are strong seconds to that, but then we get to birds and reptiles and whatnot. That's kind of, if we feel like talking about it, maybe we do.
Right.
So on the one hand, I think this encourages a bit more cross-play, because one, I've already designed this material. I'm not making it up as I go along, so I can go back a second and say, oh yeah, no, this is how rodents actually work now, and not the first time when I called them all rats because I didn't know mice existed, apparently.
Right.
And I was like, they like shiny things because they're shiny, and then like, okay, no, there's actually a whole ideological reason now behind that. I could reference that at the start. So showing more of the worlds there, I think, is valuable. But on the other hand, the crossover is a little more controllable from the guide's perspective, in the sense of they could say, I really want to focus this game around dogs and cats, so just get the cat book and the dog book, and we're not going to worry about the future rodent book. Or I really want to do my Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles ripoff, so we're going to get Pugmire, we're going to get Pirates of Pugmire in first edition or whatever, and convert Turtles over. I mean, it becomes more as you want to function your game. Whereas with the initial idea of having three books, we kind of always had to keep all of them in the mix, even if it didn't quite entirely make sense.
Right. Yeah. Now, that actually kind of goes into what I was going to ask about next in terms of conversion. Some people out there with a Pugmire game or a Monarchies of Mao game or something like that they've been playing for a while with their longtime weekly group or something like that. How simple of a process is it going to be for them to go through this and frankly the Pugmire book and convert it perhaps to their current system, to how things are going right now?
Oh, it's going to be pretty simple. I always meant it to be pretty easy to convert, but two things. There are two kind of major road bumps to that. The first is the exciting decisions that Hasbro made at the beginning of last year in regard to the open game license.
Exciting, weren't they?
They were super exciting, especially when you're a week out from launching a game based on that game system.
Jesus, yeah, that was super exciting. Yeah.
So for legal purposes, obviously some terms had to change and whatnot. But to be fair, even when that was happening, one of the things that we talked about internally and then outwardly is that Pugmire was never at its heart completely a D&D 5th edition game.
Right.
It was heavily based on it. It was derived from it. But it wasn't always compatible, as some people found when they started just trying to apply things to Pugmire and realizing it doesn't quite work.
No.
The analogy I've given sometimes is that you install one Linux system on your computer and you go, oh, therefore it works on all Linux systems, and that's not actually how it works if you know anything about Linux.
Right.
Or like trying to install a Windows 10 program on a Windows 8 computer. Yep. It's like technically the same, but not really.
But you're going to run into some issues. Yeah.
Right. So it actually, I think, was valuable to kind of push system into being more explicitly its own thing, and allowed me to make a couple minor rules changes to the back ends. But a lot of those changes are just simply wherever you would find the rule in the original game, you now find the rule in the new game, and just use that instead. Mm-hmm. But the pointers all kind of work, except for, and this is the second one, is how enemies are calculated.
Okay.
Because the first edition was based roughly on the OGL-based monster mechanics, mm-hmm. and they are garbage.
Yeah.
Because for those who don't know, challenge rating is this weird abstract thing that is based on a challenge rating monster is equal to exactly 4 characters of that level.
Yeah. Except
when it isn't. Which is most of the time. And then also, what the hell does a CR0 mean in that case?
It's so unnecessarily obtuse. It was such a simple system before where it's like, okay, level. There we go. That's I will never understand that change. I truly won't.
Nope. And that's why I just went back to the original version, which is like now it's enemy level. Mm-hmm. And so if I have 3 level 3 characters, like I just did an actual play a couple days ago. I had 3 level 3 characters. Cool. I have 9 levels of antagonists I could put together. So I threw, in this case, 10 level 1 mm-hmm. Rats at them. And so slightly a little more. They struggled for a little bit, but I broke it down into smaller encounters, and they were fine after that. And so, yeah, it's like, cool. I had this many levels to play with. I picked this many levels of monster, drop it in. You're more or less fine. I also leaned heavily into more what I call tags. Tags, something that was kind of mentioned in passing in the first issue, but they didn't really do anything. And I don't think they were even explicitly called tags, for maybe 1 or 2 sentences in the book. But now it's more explicitly a thing. So if something is the unseen tag, it's an unseen monster. So you could say this spell affects unseen, this spell affects undead, whatever. So there's that species tag. But then also there are what I'm calling encounter tags, which basically means you can modify a monster in different ways. So like if you want to say, I want to have a whole bunch of cat bandits, but I want the character kind of just mow through them real fast. You can add the minion tag to them. That comes a certain set of rules. You would then apply and modify the stat block accordingly. And the practical, there's a couple minor rules. The practical upshot is they all basically get 1 stamina point at that point in time. Mm-hmm. So really, just do you hit them? Yes, great. They die. Don't even roll damage, because if you're by default, you will get at least 1 point of damage.
Exactly. So, it's done. There's no point.
Right. And so it just becomes a fun little encounter, and vice versa. There's a legendary tag where if you want to make a boss monster version of it, then it modifies it to a point where, it's about roughly 4 or 5 antagonists against 1 of this thing. Which gets back to what CR was trying to do. But that did require me to do a lot of adjusting numbers in the back end, right? So I had how spells work, how much damage those do, how much damage weapons do, all that stuff. A lot of boring spreadsheet stuff. But I did it in a way that when you pick up a new edition, you go, I had this spell. I'll look at the conversion document, which we're going to provide, and it says, okay, this spell is not that spell. I use that spell instead. It has some new numbers. I don't care how they came about. I just start using new numbers, and the system works. Right. That was my goal. So from the user perspective, from the people playing the game, the only bump you're going to run into is that if you want to use a first edition enemy, you're going to have to rebuild the stats a little bit. And again, there's a thing in second edition that says, here's how you do it. But also in this case, for Curious Cats of Mao, if there was a enemy mentioned in Monarchies of Mao, we have converted it to in this book. So if you pick up the new edition, then all that work's done for you already.
Now, along those lines, when it comes to playing the game, one of the things that I think a lot of people ran into with the original trilogy there was that it made sense that they were all three their own games, because they kind of leaned in towards different styles of game, whereas you had a big, grand adventure kind of thing with Pugmire. I keep hearing a lot of people compare Monarchies of Mao, the original edition, to kind of a more vampire political intrigue kind of thing, and then finally Squeaks in the Deep, my personal favorite of the three, by the way, was very much dungeon crawly, explorer kind of, and so now, having said all of that, obviously, if this goes the same way, Squeaks in the Deep eventually gets integrated into this and everything like that. And I'm not going to put the cart before the horse there. Let's one thing at a time, obviously. But how having it now as a set of expansions from an original overarching game, how does that change the way that you play the game, if at all?
Well, so that was the thing, is when I had Monarchies as its own separate system, people were playing it very differently, but the actual things they were doing mechanically didn't change radically. And again, the actual rules changes initially were, like I said, a very short list. It turns out there was a whole new subset that I forgot to even put in the rules. I referenced it, but never actually put it in the rule book somehow. To the point where I knew it was there. I went to go look it up to correct the writer on that, and it just wasn't in the rule book. So for 6 years, I just didn't know.
You're just this is how the illusion that it was there.
This is how good I am at my job. But what it comes down to is basically just kind of doing lots of, well, these rules work this way, but, and I certainly tried to keep them down, because in point where it's like, I wanted to keep it to, if it's a small rule, if it's forgotten the table, it's not going to change things too much. And so things in that category are stuff like, if you use the ready action as a cat, you get a boon, additional die to roll. Because cats are a bit more planners and thinkers than dogs. And to avoid power creep, the flip side to that is that a lot of the cat spells do not work as easily as dog spells do. I'll get to that in a second. Okay. So this is being balanced. It's not just here's more cool stuff. The other rule on the cat side is that if you do something specifically that would contribute fortune to the pool, you can keep that for yourself instead. It's a small rule, so that way you have a small personal pool of fortune that you can keep to yourself, and you don't have to ask anybody else to use it. So if you want to do things that you think the party's not going to like, you can start to steadily build a small group of things to back up your play to get that intrigue vibe going. But again, if you forget that rule and just let fortune work as normal, that's fine. Nothing breaks. It's just here's an additional option if you remember to use it. The other one is on the magic side. Again, part of it is on the back ends. We recalibrated the magic, but the new rule on the magic side is that if you roll a botch, which is a natural one on the die, your spell goes badly. And the other piece, because this ties ideologically, but the other piece is that cats don't get the benefits of increasing magic items that dogs get. It's like dogs pick a magic sword, they can actually, every time they go up on level, theoretically improve that sword and make that sword better and better and better. Cats can't do that, but they can break those items and take those powers into themselves and then improve powers themselves. So ideologically, how that works is cats are basically, they're really good at hacking magic, and so their magic is generally bigger and flashier and more powerful than dogs, but it's also going to go more badly wrong for them. Dogs are good at taking magic, compartmentalizing it, putting it into things, and making sure it stays stable. So they're good at stable magic. So cats have more opportunities to do things really cool for themselves, but also they have more opportunities to backfire on them. And so that's the kind of push and pull. But again, if you forget a large chunk of these rules, the game doesn't break. It just kind of falls into a rough middle ground. That's because I built Pugmire to dogs to be the stable middle ground. Obviously, with Squeaks Deep, I'll probably push it in slightly different directions. So you have a slightly different take from that. So as long as you're moving away from the center in different ways, if players forget those rules, it flows back to the center. Mm-hmm. The only big thing you have to kind of remember is about the artifacts. That's the only part where it gets a little weird, because the whole point of that change is, if you're doing a mixed party of dogs and cats and you find a magic sword, you then get to have the fun roleplay opportunity of deciding who gets that sword, because not just who can use it, it's okay, if I get that sword, I'm going to break it.
It's gone.
And dogs are like, no, you don't want you to do that.
Oh, that is interesting. Now, you've had playtest games, obviously. We've got some streams of mm-hmm. games going on right now, pre-release games. How are you noticing people playing this form of Mao versus the first version of it? Are they going for a similar? Do you find them playing in a similar way that they did in the past, or are they going for something completely different now?
I do think there's a bit of a shift, but I don't think it has anything to do with the rules. Weirdly enough, one of the things that I wanted to push in this edition is that there is a little more sci-fi and a little more, I use horror in air quotes here, darkness might be better, a little more edge, I guess, to it, because the humor, lighthearted, family-friendly part of the game is down. Everyone gets that. That's solid. We don't need to continue to expand upon that. Mm-hmm. And the fantasy part, again, people get D&D with dogs, great, but it was always meant to be in our distant future. So the first time around, there was some concern, and valid concern, that people wouldn't get this concept, because it was 2015, right? It's like, are people ready to play a D&D game with dogs? If there's science fiction on top of it, there might be too many things for them to figure out and learn.
Right.
But then dogs playing D&D has become practically a meme at this point. So that part no one has a problem with. Says, okay, now we can say, okay, so D&D with dogs is a known quantity. We can then add, but your fantasy game is secretly a science fiction game to that, and like people kind of move up that step. Mm-hmm. Similarly, so tonally, it's the one of the things that we saw with Squeaks in the Deep was people really dug the spooky vibe of Squeaks in the Deep.
Loved it, absolutely.
And I've always felt that Pugmire is a game that has the potential for darkness in a very opt-in way, right? It's not a horror game by default, mm-hmm. But I wanted to encourage people to do more of that. And I think because cats are naturally, we associate them with like Halloween, we associate them with nighttime. I think cats have always had that potential. But again, the first time around, I was already throwing in cats plus D&D plus intrigue. So I didn't want to add too many layers onto that. Now that I have a whole source book, I don't have to spend a lot of pages just reiterating the rules again. Mm-hmm. I can say, okay, let's take some time to actually dig into this a bit more. And so I did one for Red Room Role Playing, which was much more kind of weird sci-fi nonsense. Mm-hmm. And they really dug that, and then that worked really well. And so, cool, great. That piece, that's a change, an adjustment worked. And the one I'm doing for the Twitch stream here on WP, I added much more intrigue. And again, the players got it. And now, to be fair, the players were also people who worked in the book, so that's a little kind of stacking the deck, as it were.
They've got some insights, yeah.
Right. But again, like to your point, I'd always envisioned this being more of the masquerade or vampire-y style intrigue stuff, just enough to get them to rub up against other NPCs and maybe have some fraught conversations as a group, but never like go straight full PvP. I never wanted to go that far. Right. It's always been more like enough to kind of just go, well, we could do this or we could do this, and how are we getting played and whatnot. And I mean, even if you take vampire off the table, also that kind of the Shadowrunny vibe of like with dogs, just we're going to go do a mission and it'll be great and we'll be rewarded and everything will be fine. With cats, we're going to do a mission. So how are we going to get screwed and at what point?
Right.
It's
not a question of whether, it's a question of when.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, some of the mechanics are suggested because like with a dog, it's like we got out, we got the thing. It's like, I got the thing. It's like, you're a good dog. Here's the thing. Great. Here's the thing. That's so good. With the cat, it's like, now I got the thing. Who's going to break it and who benefits from breaking this?
Right.
Let's have that conversation now. And do we get to benefit? Maybe we should benefit for breaking this.
Yeah. What's your argument that you should get to benefit from it versus me? Yeah.
Right. Because there's an individualism slightly enshrined in the mechanics, players are going to naturally ask those questions, even if they're not role-playing, but just thinking mechanically, which leads to good role-play and conversations. So I think that stuff's been happening more. And again, some of it was because some bits of things I thought were explicit were not explicit. And so now, okay, let's make that explicit now. But also just having more room because, to be blunt, Monarchies of Mal first edition, the monarchy is equated to here's 3 or 4 paragraphs for each monarchy, and it's all you get. And now we could do things like here's their capital city, here's a bunch of locations in that capital city, here's the tenor and tone of that capital. Right. What is it like to be a citizen of Mal versus being a citizen of Rex versus being a citizen of Siberian?
It did always feel to me when I started to get a good look at what was happening here with these new editions, was that it felt kind of like new campaign settings in a way. That Monarchies of Mal had more to do with, to compare it to something like Dragonlance, for example, not one-to-one, obviously, but it has more to do with that world within an overarching setting. Does that make sense? I mean, does that sound...
Yeah. I mean, because so this has been an interesting kind of push and pull of creator with an audience, is because I think a lot of people have been trained that when you get a fantasy setting, you get a big, massive book that tells you absolutely everything about the fantasy setting, and then you apply the fantasy setting. I grew up during the 80s, and so my sensibility is something that has been largely categorized under the old school Renaissance camp, which I don't necessarily subscribe to, but for purposes of discussion works well enough, which is you get maybe 3 pages of background setting and you just make up the rest. So the first edition of Pugmire was closer to that. Like here's a kingdom, here's a map with a bunch of blank space, figure it out. And I would ask you questions like, when are we going to get the world map? And the answer is never, because I don't want to detail that much. But I have since heard the argument of like it was a little too spare, right? People really liked what I was bringing to the table specifically, and there's lots of like people would ask questions, I'd rattle off an answer, say where's that written down? It's like I don't know, it's just in my head,
right? Because
I figured you'll do something different in your game. So the compromise has been something like this, where it's like if I take out all the rules for Mal and I say, cool, here's more about cat society, right? And allow people to better understand my perception on cats, and to be fair, the whole team's perception on cats, because Lauren Roy's my co-dev brought a tons of table on this because she asked a bunch of questions. I'm like, I don't know, that sounds good. Because aside from, I had a lot of things I wanted to have done, but there's a lot of edges in that coloring page that I didn't have a clear answer for. And so the team were able to say, what if we did this? And for example, one of that was the 6 monarchies. I knew at a very broad stroke what I want each monarchy to represent, but in terms of specifics, I really had no idea. And the team came up with some fantastic stuff. Like one of my favorite bits is Angora. Angora was always the kind of intellectual society. We sit around in cafes and debates philosophy and hoard knowledge, and we are the kind of politician mages of the monarchies. And there's lots of trees and growth and symbols of building, but they're right next to a desert. And something that the book kind of digs into a little bit is like there's a bit of protesting too much. It's like, yes, we have our library in a giant tree, and that's kind of a performative stunt.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, we can grow this giant tree next to a desert. What? Step up, in a very polite, genteel way. It's showing off. And I'm like, that's actually really cool. That's a piece that's there, but I personally never intended it to kind of click that way, but it clicks so well. It's like, yes, I'm happy to say that is true, and that's absolutely how it should work.
What are some of the other? That's a great segue into what I wanted to ask next. What are some of the other changes, not just in Mao here, but in Pugmire, that excited you the most when you really started getting the juices flowing, getting the team going? Give me some examples of stuff that got you.
I think I've covered a lot of the mechanical ones. I think the only ones we haven't talked about real much is around social stuff, because Pugmire, I've always tended to be a game where you could make friends with enemies as well as fight them. But when you're kind of limited to a D&D style frame, there aren't many options in that front. When I kind of was able to jettison that baggage, I was able to do a couple things I've always wanted to do. One of those was to reframe charisma, now presence, into more social awareness, because in D&D proper, how it works is, when's the last time you made a charisma save for anything in D&D? Right. It exists because all the stuff that would logically fall under a social save becomes wisdom. And so I was like, so let's just reframe presence into being, not only are you good at being social, but also you're good at recognizing things social happening too, because that's really true. If you are a social person, you also know how social engineering works on some level. Right. Yeah. So now I can do presence saves or tests now. And so like it's if someone's trying to convince you to do something, that's what you roll on. So you might be really kind of cunning, but you may not get when someone's trying to manipulate you, which I also felt like is closer to how people actually work, frankly.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
So I close that loophole. But then the other thing is also, two other mechanics around that. One is a disposition chart. It's pretty simple, but basically it's is someone your friend or not, right? And so you can adjust that in a couple of easy ways to change someone's minds. Something that was always kind of done ad hoc at the table, but I wanted to give both players and guides a little more rigor on that mechanically. So it's like, hey, I'm a really social character. Do I just roll a die and they're friends with me? It's like, okay, let's give it a little bit, just enough to kind of make that work.
Right.
I mean, and then the other side, enemies have morale, so they get you scared them to go away. So that's all tied together.
Got my own personal cast member of Mao here.
Hi. Do you want to play Mao?
He would. He's a vicious son of a bitch. This is Jonesy.
Hi, Jonesy.
And now, this is kind of a more general question, but it's something I think about a lot. I'm seeing a lot in game design, a lot more examples of games that do just what you were describing, more social-based checks, tests, successes, that kind of thing. Almost sometimes in a way that resembles the way that combat is usually run. Why do you think that it took so long for something like that to catch on?
It's funny you mention that, because hilariously, it's not that it takes long to catch on; it's that we had to get back to it.
Oh, okay.
So back when the pandemic was more of a thing, I ended up doing a short series of videos with Drive-Thru RPG called History Check, where I actually walked through some not obscure, but less documented historical game systems, kind of roughly hitting a decade at a time until the modern day, to kind of give a vague roadmap on how RPGs have evolved, right? A lot of the early ones, because nobody had anything to do, it's like, sure, let's have a social jousting mechanic, right? Let's have a political intrigue mechanic. Now, of course, back in the 70s and 80s, all of these were bespoke.
Right.
So there wasn't any kind of unified system. It's like, I don't know, let's make a whole new system and just kludge it onto here. But combat was also kind of kludged on there, so that wasn't necessarily a problem. And then to a degree, what was the problem for this? In the 90s, it was what if you just talked, right? What if we just had a conversation? That's cool. And so they really pushed the social dynamic. And so to remove the barriers for that, they took a lot of that stuff off the table and said, you can just talk and roll some dice and then stuff happens. But because you will die from talking, we still have to have at least some mechanics around combat. So the default for decades was, if it killed your character, we have to have some decent rules around it. But other than that, just make it up. But certainly, I don't know how other designers feel, but I've always felt that the reality is it's not the consequences of the rules that require rigor. It is how much the game cares about it.
Right.
And the example I go to, mostly because it makes people go, what? Is the Street Fighter role-playing game.
What?
See? Because in the Street Fighter role-playing game, the main thing you do is punch people. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of rules around punching people. And the reason why no one realized how kind of innovative that was is because it was just an even more elaborate combat system.
Right.
But it wasn't exactly. It was very specific style of combat because they're trying to get closer to emulating specifically how those kinds of fighting games worked. Mm-hmm. Which is one-on-one combat using a variety of very specialized moves that has certain kind of counters and attack benefits. And so they redesigned combat to look like that. And so from that standpoint, it's like if you're going to do, say, a Jane Austen style game about a social party, it should look mechanically pretty similar to Street Fighter, right? Mm. Which is I'm using this particular social attack. Like this, I am a debutante who's trying to seduce this strong, very serious soldier. So my humor attack's not going to work well on him because he has a huge humor defense. Right. Because he's a stalwart character. But flattery probably would work. Right. So I should choose the flattery attack instead. And when you start thinking from that perspective, you can also look at like, okay, if you do a Sherlock Holmes style game, if you do a game about mental conflicts, how you approach a mystery, and this is what Gumshoe functionally did, right? The Gumshoe system, which is you have a whole bunch of different stats about what kind of detective you are, not that you're a detective. Right. So I think that's kind of how that evolution has gone, which is that if it's important to your game, this is what you roll, and everything else doesn't matter. The humorous logical extreme to this is Matthew asked me to write. They came from the Steel Dragon tournament.
Oh, I love it. Yes,
which is the fighting game tournament. It's like, I can do my Street Fighter pastiche, great. And so Matthew was like, the big question to worry about is why everyone wouldn't just take close combat, because it's the logical thing. Sure. And so I'm like, well, because it's a humor game, I can go this far, but the reality is that every skill does damage, right? And the example I pulled from is the Street Fighter challenge of beating up a car. Mm-hmm. So it's like, okay, I want to hack a computer. I punch the computer, right. And that gets me into the system. I want to convince someone and punch them in the face. And they go, sure, I'll do what you say, So close combat becomes actually the worst skill because only thing you can do with that is hurt somebody. But everything else hurts somebody and does something else. Right, right.
Oh, that's fun. That's really funny.
Right. So with Pugmire, I knew that I never wanted to do a completely bespoke system, right? Because I don't want to do the kind of edition where it's like, yeah, throw the old edition out, we're starting fresh again. Right. But even back the first iteration of the game, I always wanted something that was an homage to classic fantasy gaming, because part of the point of it is that the more you're using common fantasy gaming language, the more you will buy into the fact that this is a fantasy world that's actually it's a science fiction world in fantasy drag. Right. So if you're using a setting or a mechanical system that feels either neutral or science fiction, you're going to keep falling out of that. But if you're using D&D language, then you're going to keep thinking of it as D&D. It's a psychological thing. And D&D does combat well. So like there's only so far I could move that away from that center while keeping it still the game it's supposed to be. But at the end of the day, I also realized that I don't want dogs making friends to be a hard thing. It's like on some level, I do want it to be, this dragon's scary. I try to make friends with it. I make a dice roll. Okay, you rolled a natural 20. The dragon's friends with you. Right. I want it to be that simple. Yeah. So I don't want to add too much. So really the big thing is let's add just enough to that. And also just enough to because I dialed up the damage a little bit, so that it's slightly harder to kill monsters. By having morale, it's okay, can I scare them away? Can I just leave me alone?
Yeah. That really is kind of the overall balancing act of all game design, isn't it? Finding that balance between the gamer's autonomy, basically their choices and what they want to do, and actually giving them some level of foundation to stand on.
Yeah, and that's something that's getting off topic slightly, but that's something I know as we continue to work on Storypath Ultra games, because Storypath Ultra, or even original Storypath, was always kind of, there are 3 compartments and they're roughly equal. So that's kind of the other direction of the conversation we just had, which is they're all roughly strong and important, so let's give them roughly equal mechanical weight. It's always going to slightly shift towards combat, just because, again, all things being equal, then we have to go back to stakes, and a character dying is still the highest consequence of an action, so that's still going to move things off. But with Ultra, that's one thing to talk about. Social is the one where the second highest stake is I lose control of my character.
Yeah.
So that also used to be important. And so something that we've been integrating into that is the idea of the hard bargain, which is that you can do this, and if you say no, you can say no, it's fine, but then you have to pay a different penalty.
Right.
And so you still have autonomy. The autonomy is you can choose between two terrible options, but you still get a choice.
But you still get a choice, exactly.
Right.
That's great. I want to ask a very important question now, related to Mao, but more in the lines of Pugmire. In the world, you kind of touched on it briefly before, the idea that dogs are a meme now, just the level of devotion people have for their dogs. Why aren't there more dog RPGs? It's funny because I know of 3 of them, and the main reason why I know of 3 of them is because every time one pops up, I get 5 or 6 people going, "You should sue them. They're making Pugmire." And it's like, I cannot legally protect dogs in a fantasy tabletop role playing game. I thank you for your enthusiasm. Good dog. Here's your treat. Yeah. Your passion is admirable.
Right.
Go over there.
But I think honestly it comes down to animals in role-playing games have been around for a good long time. I don't think Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles role-playing game was the first, but certainly it was an early case of that. But a lot of those games are, you could play either whatever animal you want to, or a fairly wide range. So they became kind of generically animal role-playing game, not necessarily noun animal. Cats have always been, I think, a particular fascination of people, because in a lot of ways, cats are the closest to people, right? And I recognize that what I'm about to say is going to potentially frustrate or upset people, but I have always felt that dogs are the people we want to be, and cats are the people we are.
Right. Yeah.
Because the ideal relationship with dogs is that dogs are good and loyal and faithful and will care for you. And those are things that we want to espouse for. Dogs can also be mean and cruel and vicious, but culturally, we don't necessarily ascribe those attributes to dogs. Cats can also be loyal and faithful and dutiful and protective, but we tend to think of them more as individualistic and finicky and opinionated. So fairly or unfairly, and I think unfairly is actually valid, but culturally, we generally ascribe positive attributes to dogs and less positive attributes to cats, which makes them more interesting. So more cat-specific games out there, because is it interesting playing a cat? What's it like playing a cat?
Right.
What's like to be in that mindset. Whereas dogs, people think incorrectly, I feel, that there's not much range there. So by mapping the kinds of things associated with dogs to the kinds of things we like fantasy protagonists to be, there's so much overlap in the Venn diagram that then it becomes, oh, okay, well, I like honorable, nice, heroic characters. Why can't I like playing an honorable, nice, heroic dog?
Right. We're getting down to the end here, and I've got 2 big questions for you. Huge questions, important questions.
The good ones, right?
They're all important questions. We know that.
Yes.
You're on the show. You get it. One of my favorite things that you used to see a lot in especially in the World of Darkness books were recommended reading, recommended consumption, movies you should watch, music you should listen to get into that gothic punk mood or whatever. When it comes to Curious Cats of Mal, could you give me a few pieces of media that you think would get people geared up in the right direction?
I'm actually going to pull up the manuscript because I could rattle some off and then I'll find out, there's not in the book at all. And people go, but you didn't mention any of these. So I'm actually going to pull those up because I did change quite a few of them from last time. And Lauren and I actually had some conversations about this, particularly because what we collectively thought about Monarchies of Mal was a little different than, like I said, we've adjusted dials a tiny bit. And also, frankly, some new media has really come out. And I've consumed some new media. So one of the ones which I think was a surprise to some people when they first heard of it is the Elric series.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Because he is a kind of gothic, opinionated guy who serves chaos with an asshole for a weapon. But I mean, like how Elric deals with the I am the emperor of everything and fuck all of y'all is actually pretty good rough tone for something like Curious Cats, right? I also mentioned the Song and Ice of Fire series. I mentioned this in the first edition too, purely for the political intrigue. Certainly tonally, it's very different. So not necessarily true. But really, it's more that kind of War of the Roses part of English history that's more kind of Tudor era. I know those aren't necessarily the same thing, but you know, from the War of the Roses to the Tudor era stuff, that kind of intrigue I think is relevant. But more kind of positive side is that since these books came out, there's been a huge bump in kind of what I've been thinking of as Netflix fantasy.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So particularly She-Ra and the Princesses of Power and the Dragon Prince.
Oh, okay, great.
Because that kind of vibe of friends who don't always are very different from each other, but find reasons to connect and work together, work really well. And She-Ra more for the weird tech, because it's always been She-Ra and He-Man both been always been kind of sci-fi plus fantasy anyway.
Yeah, totally.
And then Dragon Prince is more about the trying to be friends in a world of intense political maneuvering. It's really, really good.
Yeah.
And then on the video game side, also on the comic side, because it's also a French comic, but there's a great game called Black Sad Under the Skin.
Okay.
And it's actually set in the 30s or 40s, a little vague. But all the characters are animal protagonists, and the main protagonist is a PI cat. But it's really good in the sense of it does the animal comic thing of each person who is an animal exhibits that animal's traits. But what Black said that's interesting is that it then twists and subverts that in a way that is not too far removed from the original concept. So Black Sad, the detective, is originally was a soldier who basically saw some horrible things in the war and decided that he needed to get back to civilization, only to find civilization was so much worse than the war he was in. So the reason why he is an aloof, grumpy cat that pushes boundaries is because of the trauma he's seen.
Right.
And so the whole comics like that is like all the characters exhibit their animal traits, but there's a reason.
Right.
And that's something that I think is fundamental to Pugmire as a whole is that, yes, on the surface level, the dogs and the cats fight each other and they hate each other, and the cats are all fighting amongst each other and the dogs are all trying to work together. And that's all true, but when you dig in, you find out the reasons why, and that's where the interest happens. It doesn't invalidate that surface level, but it gives more context and texture to it.
That's terrific. I've been writing these down.
Yeah.
Good recommendations.
I mean, if I had to pick one, it's hard to say, but I mean, I do even outside of inspiration, Black Sad, the comic and the video game are both really great. The video games, it's a choose your own adventure kind of thing. So like if you play a Telltale style game, it's in that same vein. So it's like maybe 5-6 hours. It's a short game, but it's really, really good. And the comic is fantastic. They're pretty short because they're done in the French style. So each volume is like only 50 some pages.
Oh, nice. Okay, great. Yeah, I have a 2-month-old now, so I don't have time for anything but the short stuff.
Right. These are short media.
Yeah, that's where it's at for me right now for a while, it looks like. One last thing, and this is the big one. What we've talked about the fact that this is an expansion as opposed to its own thing. We've talked a little bit about the change in play style, that sort of thing. What else is it out that you need people who are interested, a little intrigued, but maybe haven't checked out the backer kit or anything like that yet? What is it you would like them to know? It can be more than one thing.
I think the big thing is that this is an expansion in every sense of the word, right? Not only is it an extension of Realms of Pugmire, but it is expanding on even the material in Monarchism out, right? So yes, we're going to take the original material and update it to the new edition, but it's not just reprinting those rules with new numbers. Everything has been rewritten, expanded. For one thing, the setting has had a very mild time skip. So it is an undefined number of years, but somewhere around the neighborhood of 2 to 3 years after the first edition. And so the political situation has changed. And that ramification has gone through all of Mao. So the high pitch for Mao is that the original monarch Trelawney is dead.
Okay.
She was dying. That has now changed. And since her death, one of the first things the new monarch did is kick out the diplomats from Pugmire. Okay. So the political things are going on between two kingdoms that have cooled back. And the new monarch also is not in a strong political place. So all the different dynasts, the leaders of different monarchies, have more leeway to try to push and pull her vote and also have more things going on. So before the dynasts were kind of just a bunch of random names in the back of the book, now they each have their own kind of political agenda going on. The other thing is that the House Smilodon, which is kind of, again, a throwaway, here's a few paragraphs of a cool character enemy group you can use if you want to. They're now the big focus in this book. Nice. This is the secret 7th house that were banished that no one talks about, but everyone knows about. Now they have not only come back, but they've been here all along and no one really knew. So again, in a intrigue-laden game, it's the kind of secret invasion, if you will, to use a Marvel term. A bunch of people turn out to have always been Smilodon spies, maybe possessed by demons, some maybe not. But the demon infestation in the monarchies is way worse than anyone ever imagined. And then the 3 adventures in the back do provide a rough arc to kind of take you through the big steps of that storyline. So the new thing that we've done, this has not been done in any of the other books before, is we say, here's all the pieces, here's the rough storyline, and now we're going to take you through the big beats of that exact storyline. We don't finish it. It ends at roughly 6 levels, so it gives you 4 more levels to kind of really, figure out which direction you want to take this in. But it does the uncovering House Smilodon, confronting House Smilodon, dealing with the consequences of that confrontation. Those are kind of the big rough steps. So it really is not just, here's how to play cats. It's, here's how to play cats. Here's this entire society. Here's a whole new storyline to get involved with and a whole new antagonist to really dig into. So it's just way more information than we ever presented that. And on top of that, we've taken the whole new spellcasting calling, which was the mystic we covered in Pirates of Pugmire, who's the nature. Originally it was a sea witch, but now they're kind of expanded to a nature druid style thing. They've been pulled in and reimagined, and they now have whole new spells rather than just using spells other cats had access to. So you now have 3 spellcasting classes as opposed to just 2, and they all have access to all new spells. So again, this is very much, it's not just, here's the patch, the original game. It's a remaster in every respect.
That's fantastic. Well, Eddy, thank you so much for joining us here on Meet Your Makers. Could you want to give them your pluggables?
Yeah, absolutely. If people, first of all, obviously, the reason why we're here, main reason why we're here is, if you haven't checked it already, please go to BackerKit, search for Curious Cats of Mao. That's still ongoing. We have funded, so the book's happening regardless. We're now purely into stretch goal lands, but to be clear, the bigger the numbers are, both as backers and as money, the more confidence Onyx Path gets in doing even more Pugmire books. So I'm not saying we won't do future books based on this, but it certainly helps. The better this does, the more confidence we can make, and also the more confidence retailers have to pick up the books and put them in their stores. So there's lots of reasons to get that number as big as possible beyond just, hey, we crossed the finish line. If you're still interested in anything about Pugmire, if you're brand new to this, you can go to my website, realmsofpugmire.com, and there you'll find access to all the first edition stuff. None of that's going away. It's still going to be available, just not in stores, because those books don't exist anymore. We ran out of printer. We were sold out of the first edition of Pugmire. There are no more in the warehouse. And that was after a second printing even, which is very exciting. Yeah, it was, honestly. We decided to do second printing, and then those are gone too. It's like, well, good thing we're doing an edition then, I guess.
Yeah, there you go. We win.
But also you can pre-order the new edition Realms of Pugmire from there, and also there's a link to the Curious Cats thing. If you're just curious about me and other stuff I do outside of talking cats and dogs and mice and rats, my website is pugsteady.com, which I have recently just updated to get rid of all the dead links and outdated information. That was 2 hours of my life, but it was worth it because it's been a while. It said I was still living in the U.S., for example, so it was a bit out of date.
That was worth the time, I think.
Yeah. It was pointing to video games that don't exist anymore, stuff like that, and then, of course, if you like this kind of stuff outside of the Onyx Path Twitch, not every Friday anymore because I'm not on every episode, but most of the time I do an episode of the Onyx Pathcast. We talk about stuff, sometimes including Pugmire. Recently, I did an episode about working on Curious Cats of Mao. My co-developer Lauren also did a whole episode on Curious Cats of Mao. So you can also listen to me there and the Onyx Path Discord. You can find me there, usually in the Onyx Pathcast channel, in the Realms of Pugmire channel, or just post a Transformers meme, and I probably will be there within minutes. So
he'll appear as if summoned. That's just how it works.
People joke about that, but it has actually happened on a disturbing regular basis where I happen to be checking Discord and someone posts and say, "Hey, what's up?"
It's a smoke bomb, but it makes the sound. Well, this has been Meet Your Makers. I have been your host, Phil Keeling. If you want to listen to more of my voice, please check out my podcast, Pixel Lit, the best podcast about video game novelizations, because it's the only podcast about video game novelizations. Someone's going to make one just to challenge us.
Just someday.
Just to challenge us, and I can't do that tag anymore. But today is not that day. We just recently got picked back up. We had some alternate guests because I was on paternity leave, but I have returned, and we are covering Kelly Lee's latest Halo book, Epitaph. So,
nice.
Yeah. I mean, and we're going to have an interview with her at the end of the week, which I'm really excited about. And
cool.
Check it out. Anywhere podcasts are made, developed, stripped of their skin, and processed for your consumption.
Now I want to go back into my news bunker.
All right. I'll see y'all in your news bunkers on Meet Your Makers. See you later, guys. Bye.
Bye.